Linda, and thanks Peter, to you and your colleagues for the opportunity to speak this morning. I appreciate it. I've been asked just to say a few words about competition policy in the light of the Competition Policy Review. I guess it's also topical because the COAG meeting last week produced what we had hoped would be an agreement amongst the jurisdictions to advance the competition policy agenda. Regrettably, at least from my perspective, it's not been signed by the Labor states, but only by the Conservative states, but there at least is an agreement. And maybe, notwithstanding Saul's remarks about politics and the obstacle or impediment that it presents, maybe there might be the beginning of some argy-bargy and we might see something down the line. But at the very least, the agreement which was presented to the COAG leaders last Friday contained the essence, the kernel, of the Competition Policy Review recommendations. A new set of competition policy principles, a recommended set of, or agenda I should say, of reviews, and all of that was very much in line with the recommendations of the Competition Policy Review. I'm pleased, of course, the competition policy figures on the agenda here, and in answer to the Productivity Commission's question, where to from here, at least in the case of competition policy, I'd like to say just follow the yellow brick road. Right? The Competition Policy Review, my colleagues and I, including Melissa over here, spent a year of our lives working through these recommendations. There are 56 of them in the report. We commended them to the government at the time, at least. The Labor opposition indicated that it only rejected 3 of them. So I was hoping for a greater degree of bipartisanship than we've actually experienced to date. But it would appear that it's got a lot to do with Commonwealth-state relations and other agendas more than competition policy itself, but that is yet to be seen. So yes, we have 56 recommendations in there. Competition policy is an essential element of any agenda to drive productivity growth. It isn't all there is, of course, but it's an essential element of that. And the logic, I think, is really quite clear. And that is that competition essentially, for economists, boils down to choice. And giving people choice over alternatives drives efficiency and innovation. There's nothing that concentrates the mind, at least in the commercial world, more wonderfully than the word no. Thank you very much, but no. I prefer this one over here. That immediately sets in train, as anyone would know from the private sector, a lot of soul searching about what it is that's driven people away. Are we too expensive? How can we lower our costs? How can we be more attractive? How can we be more innovative? So the essence of the competition policy agenda is driving choice and focusing laser-like on those things that obstruct or restrict choice. The enemy of choice is exclusion. And exclusion can occur officially through regulations and policies which exclude what, where, when, by whom. And you think of the raft of them, the trading hours restrictions, the planning and zoning rules, dare I say it in the presence of Professor King, the pharmacy location rules, import restrictions, parallel import restrictions, licensing rules, and the whole box and dice. Not suggesting that none of those things is supportable. Obviously, there is a public interest test to be passed here. The public interest test naturally draws attention to instances where competition and choice is by itself contrary to the public interest, and instances where there may be no alternative to achieve a particular objective than restricting choice. Classically, people speak about free sales of alcohol and things of that sort, where the actual competitive mechanism itself, giving people choices, more of the same, different at different times, greater access, is actually inimical to the public interest, and there isn't any way to secure the public interest, so the argument goes, than by skewering choice itself. Now, acknowledging that the public interest test is important, but at the end of the day, as Peter emphasised in his opening remarks, we're not on about productivity for its own sake. We're on about prosperity. We're on about making ourselves and our communities better off. And there are some things that are inimical to that. Interestingly enough, although I had a lot of discussion about alcohol and one or two other things, no one ever raised the ban on the sale of weapons. Nobody said anything about that. And yet if you take the competitive logic to its extreme, of course you'd say, well, it should apply there too. We should have a review of the ban on personal firearms. Well, nobody raised that, not in 1,000 submissions. Because I think most Australians get they get the idea that competition, productivity and the agenda is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. But on the other hand, there are lots of subtle ways and lots of interested parties who would think nothing better than to restrict choice, to find ways and excuses along some of the lines that Saul has already taken us this morning, dressing it up as in fact in the public interest. Well, it may be, and this is something that needs to be tested, hence the agreement, hence the notion that this should be regularly tested and that there should be an agency that oversees that process. We had recommended the establishment of a new agency. The agreement doesn't countenance that. It countenances rejigging the National Competition Council. Well, that's fine, provided that it's given the resources and given the agenda to go through that. So one form of exclusion, which as I say is the enemy of choice, is official exclusion, regulations. The other is conduct on the part of businesses in the market. Conduct can be exclusionary, and that is what the Competition and Consumer Act sets its face against. It sets its face against exclusionary conduct in all its forms. Well, we made a whole raft of recommendations in respect of the Competition and Consumer Act. There was only one which caused any controversy, and that's the recommendation that Section 46, governing the exercise of market power, one form of exclusionary conduct that our recommendation not be accepted. In fact, that's now been accepted by the government, of course, and it stands before the Parliament, so that's on its way, we would expect, through, given that the Greens have indicated their willingness to support it, as have a couple of independents in the Senate. So official restrictions, conduct, the CCA looks after that, and access. So natural conditions in markets, what we call natural monopolies, tight points or bottlenecks. One can think of examples. Again, the Competition and Consumer Act, Part 3A in particular, deals with those types of naturally arising tight passes, bottlenecks, restrictions. Well, by their definition, they exclude, and that exclusion compromises choice. And where it compromises choice, it compromises efficiency, innovation, and productivity. So the competition agenda is right there. The Productivity Commission, as Peter and his colleagues would well know, and again in particular my colleague Stephen King, who's overseeing this, was handed by the government the review of human services. The human services recommendations were, in the view of myself and my colleagues on the Competition Policy Review, the most important. Yes, we talked about taxis and pharmacies and all the rest because we were obliged to do a root and branch review, to open every cupboard door and see what lay behind there, what had been sitting there for 20 years since Hilmer. That's why there's all talk about those other matters. But I don't think any of my colleagues, certainly not I, are suggesting, as much as I think that pharmacy location rules need to change, that the entire great wheel of Australia's productivity and living standards is turned on that axis, and it's not. But human services certainly turns up on the agenda. So what we did on the Competition Policy Review was to go where Fred Hilmer and his colleagues 20 years ago didn't go. That is to say, to take the discipline of choice and competition, thinking about competition in that vein, choice, beyond the government's front doorstep, right into the core of general government business, health, education and welfare. That the discipline of choice should be introduced there. Very helpful for us that the NDIS was launched and people were becoming more familiar with that notion during the currency of our inquiry. So I don't have any difficulty at all in getting people to think about what it is we're talking about here. I simply say, think the NDIS. And then I say, if we can give that degree of choice and command over their own destiny to Australians with a disability, why would you deny that to Australians with no disability at all? In the fastest growing areas of public expenditure, and in the case of health, also the fastest growing industry in the economy. Why would you do that? Now, in every instance, of course, there will be arguments for and against. The Productivity Commission was handed the review, its study report has just been released, and I commend that report to you. It's an excellent document. And there the PC has done what it was asked to do, to go through all of the human services and think about the ones where there may be the greatest capacity for this logic to work in our interests. And there are some suggestions there, unsurprisingly, including things like social housing, public hospitals, public dental services, end-of-life services. A lot of health services, unsurprisingly, but also, as I say, other services as well. So the PC is looking for some response to that, and I'd encourage everyone to think carefully about those recommendations, and they'll follow that up then with a series of more hard-nosed recommendations about how you would actually do this. And I was particularly pleased, Peter, in that report to see an acknowledgement of a thing that weighed on my mind as we wrote these pages, and that is that this is not a panacea. It doesn't work in every case. And there's nothing in the Competition Policy Review nor in the PC study report that says you just have to do this everywhere. In some instances, public provision will remain the most important way to do this, the most productivity enhancing way, let alone other objectives. I've mentioned COAG, so let me just conclude with one piece of advice. It was suggested that we could offer some advice to the process. In this area, of course, it's well trodden, given the review, and so I don't need to spend a lot of time on that. But let me just say that there's one thing apart from base politics which seems to have caught out the agreement and explains the Labor states' resistance, or Labor jurisdictions' resistance to signing up to the agreement at this point. It's the vexed question of competition payments. And now we approached that subject very gingerly because unlike the Hilmer Review, we did not recommend wholesale privatisation of public enterprises. In fact, there are very few left to privatise. There are some. As a result of which, as you would know, revenue went to the Commonwealth and the states got caught with a political fallout. In this instance, most of the benefits that would come from this series of recommendations will actually redound to the benefit of the states themselves. So, to quote the former Treasurer Peter Costello, who was opposed to competition payments and essentially ceased those competition payments when the Howard government took over, the states don't need to be led by the nose. They can see their own advantage and they should be encouraged along that way. So we didn't recommend that there be competition payments. What we did recommend is that it ought to be clear where the benefits and the costs lie. Reprising Saul's very helpful comment about facts. We need the evidence. We need the facts. All right, maybe it is true that they can smell it out for themselves. But of course, many members of the public can't. So we'd recommended that there be an agenda set up and then a reference to the Productivity Commission to do exactly that, to calculate the distribution of the costs and the benefits of these things one by one. Let's spell that out. And then, if there isn't any money in the pot to actually grease the wheels with competition payments, at least we will have a debate and we can see what it is that we're dealing with, and we can see how the benefits and the costs lie. I think many of the jurisdictions would be frankly surprised that the benefits, in many instances, will redound to them along with the costs. And it isn't true that somebody else benefits and we pay all the costs, but it requires the evidence to be calculated. So my piece of advice, Peter, and my hope is that during this process of PC's review, which is entirely welcome on my part, as you might imagine, is that the Commission does what it does best. Go for the numbers, do the work, do the calculations, and explain to us all where the benefits and costs lie. That will help us to rank these reforms, some of which may be nice to do but aren't really that important, and it will also help the public to gain an impression of what it is we're talking about here. At the end of the day, I think Australians viscerally understand choice. Australians, my countrymen, in my experience, and I don't exempt anyone here in this audience for a moment, I think just love to be able to say, no thanks, mate, I'm off down the road. Well, that's a very, very powerful incentive. Drives our productivity. We just need to allow it to do its work. Thank you very much.